I grew up in a small Scottish village with a population of around 100 people. The village was one shop, one pub, one park, a church, and also a graveyard. Our house was even more remote and a 20-minute drive from the epicenter of village life. But my weekly entertainment was my dad driving into the village every Saturday night to get sort of plastered at the pub, and me and my ADHD brother playing in the village forest down the road from his pub. Our dad would get us cans of Coke, which was the highlight, and we would run deep into this forest high on sugar, climbing trees, building huts, and just having a great time. We would stay out until it was pitch dark and eventually drag our dad out of the pub, and he would never come and retrieve us like he would this time. One night, as we were playing deep in the forest, my leg got stuck in some deep, thick mud. It got jammed right up to my knee, and I just couldn't pull it out, and neither could my 8-year-old big brother. I started to freak out a bit and cry uncontrollably. I thought that was the end of me. I thought that I was about to sink into the mud and never be found again. My crying freaked out my brother out even more, so he ran back to the pub to get our old man. At this point, it was starting to get dark quite fast, and I was still alone with my leg stuck. We were deeper into the forest than usual too, so I knew that I was going to be alone for a good 15 to 20 minutes. Not a great situation to be in, I thought. But as I was crying and waiting, in the corner of my eye, I saw someone run towards me. It wasn't from the direction of the pub, but from deep within the forest. I couldn't make out any major details initially, and the person was sort of blurred. I was hoping my dad would turn up at this point, and this new person would promptly stop running towards me, but no. The person got closer into my field of vision, and I could make out more details. She was a girl, and she looked sort of around my age, maybe 6 years old, I would guess. But I knew that there was something strange about her, though, because she was wearing a dark grey 1800s Victorian dress, and I was certain now that she was running straight towards me, getting closer with every step. She came up to within 2 meters of me, and then she just stopped. My leg was still stuck in the mud. Her eyes were locked into mine. I said hello, but there was no reply. No smile, just stared deep into my eyes. "What's your name?" I asked her. Still no reply. Still her black eyes were locked. I didn't think that she was a ghost or anything. She was too physical looking for that. She just dead-eyed stared at me for a really long time. She moved a little closer, not breaking eye contact. The time moved quickly, and she simply turned around and then sprinted back into the dark woods. Almost immediately after she ran off, my dad, absolutely drunk as a skunk, stumbled into the forest, mumbling and swearing under his breath, with my brother following behind. Now, I knew every single kid in that village, and none of them had ever seen her before. The direction that she came from and ran back into was just trees for miles and miles too, and as far as we knew, nobody lived in there. Her clothing was so weird too, compared to anything else I'd ever seen. That forest was not the kind of place little girls would be running around in like that too, let alone late into the night like that. I definitely wouldn't have played in there at night if I didn't have my big brother with me, but I never saw her again in the village or in the forest after that, but would have loved to have known who she was. She was definitely human in my opinion, just a very strange human who was drawn towards my loud crying and distress at the time. I don't know if there were people living in the forest or something, but like I said, I never saw her again after that. But a part of me sort of wishes that I did. So during my first year at university, I lived on campus. At the time, despite being a student, I seldom partied or drank, and instead preferred to smoke in order to take the edge off my day. I never wanted to smoke on my university campus, due to security patrolling the premises 24 hours a day, though. Weed is very much illegal in my country, and being caught would have likely resulted in my expulsion from the university, at the very least. So instead, I used to walk off campus and into a nearby wood. I was always on high alert, especially when I went by myself and alone at night. For context, I'm a female, and therefore situations like these have the ability to make me feel very uncomfortable very quickly too. I realized that I was putting myself at high risk, and therefore after sunset, I would never wander too far into the forest. I always made sure that I could see the perimeter of the tree line, which was well lit. This meant that if someone was coming towards the woods, I could always see them, but I was always far enough away into the woods where the darkness would minimize my visibility. One night, I was there just minding my own business like normal, playing on my phone, enjoying my joint, when I hear something to the left of me. I turn and look, and it's a guy, probably in his 40s, just outside the tree line peering into the woods. I was sort of crouched at the time, and another measure that I took to minimize my visibility, and honestly, I was pretty shocked to see him, so I immediately flinched, and this is the moment where I really messed up, because he hears my movement and suddenly reveals a flashlight. He starts moving towards the sound of my movement. This is where fight or flight really kicked in. I, a 19-year-old female, was not about to win a fight with a man who had a flashlight. And without another thought, too, I started hightailing it through these dark woods. I could see the projection of his flashlight against trees very close to me, which just increased my adrenaline. But my vision was perfect, and my speed, as well as ability to avoid tripping over, was pretty impressive, considering how high I was at the time too. He eventually stopped pursuing me, probably realizing that it was going to be way too much effort. I, fortunately, made it home to my dorm that night. It still unsettles me to contemplate what might have happened had he have actually caught me. I don't know who he was. He wasn't in police uniform or the uniform worn by campus security staff or anything. He was seemingly just a random guy chasing me through the forest. Maybe he was a disgruntled nearby resident who was sick of students smoking weed in the forest. I don't know. All I know is that his intentions that night, they were not good for sure, and I'm really, really thankful that I got away. So I used to work in a museum a couple of years ago. It was an open-air museum that consists of old houses that were transported from all over the country and placed in one spot. I switched between the spots that I worked in, but one of the places that I frequently worked in was one of the most remote spots, which was a little city town made out of sort of tall buildings from Europe around the 14th and 16th century. Again, these buildings are originals, and they have been transported stone by stone to this spot and rebuilt exactly. So, here's my story. Now, I usually was the first one to arrive in the morning, which meant that I opened up the buildings and switched on the lights and stuff like that. But me being often too lazy before my first cup of coffee, usually walked around in the dark to go grab my coffee and go to the toilet first. The toilets were on the second floor, and our little kitchen was sort of hidden on the third floor, and oftentimes when I was at the toilets, I would hear footsteps on the stairs and then on the third floor. It's all made out of old wood, so they creaked a lot. Me thinking it was probably the cleaning lady arriving, I head towards the third floor and open the door, only to find it empty and still dark. I'm not easily scared though, so I just sort of shrugged it off and made my coffee and went back downstairs to open for the day. But my other colleague arrives about half an hour later, and I ask her about it, and she confirmed that I was the first and only one there that morning. Every time I heard the footsteps then, when I was alone in the morning, I just sort of cheerfully greeted my fellow ghost on his way to coffee. As for my second story, this takes place in the same spot, however, not in the same building. So during the day I worked in the museum shop in an old city part, and usually it's pretty busy, so I didn't get much time to do anything else, but on days that it rained extremely hard, nobody would ever venture far enough into the park to come as far as the old city part. So on one of those days, when I was extremely bored, I decided to explore the building a bit. This one also consisted out of 3 floors. The ground floor was the shop, the first floor was storage, and the second and third floors were supposedly empty. Me being curious by nature wanted to see it, so I went up the first floor and walked up to the door that is the entryway to the stairs to the second floor. The doors are really old, so the only lock on them are these little sort of wooden pieces that you have to slide up, which I did. But as I pulled to open the door, which did open by the way, it suddenly was roughly pulled back closed, which was really strange because there was no draft of wind whatsoever. To be honest, I thought somebody was maybe on the other side, but all the doors were closed, all the windows too, and I didn't feel or hear any wind or anything, so I tried again and it was pulled closed again. By this time I was like, okay, clearly something doesn't want me to go in there, so I'll just leave it be. And that's what I did. I went back downstairs and I left it. But later I asked my other colleague about it, asking if he ever went up there and if the door was maybe locked or something. To be honest, I was so shocked by it that I thought that maybe I just imagined opening it. But he confirmed to me that it was never locked. He also said that nobody ever really went up there since one of the guards had tried to take their own life up there or something. I hadn't heard about that before, but I told my colleague about what happened to me that day, and he looked very spooked, because apparently he'd been hearing footsteps as well up there. Anyway, those were the few experiences that I had while I was working in that museum. Obviously I don't work there anymore, but I hope you enjoyed them. This was several years ago now, and I was reminded of it recently. It was bizarre enough, too, that I had to ask my wife, who had been with me, if I imagined it. So it was late at night, but still about 100 degrees out, just north of the border to Mexico. We were on a side of the road that had one sidewalk up against a wall on the right, and to the left was an open field with large rocks. I was driving, and we had driven this road almost daily, so we were familiar with it. The radio had been working poorly, so I turned it off. We were kind of tired, so maybe our perceptions were off. Maybe we only noticed this whole thing because we didn't have the radio on. But there was a man laying in the gutter in a light blue button-down shirt, blue jeans, brown shoes, face down, still, just below the sidewalk. This occurred within a few seconds that felt like they took longer. My wife wanted to make sure that he was still breathing. I slowed down the car and pulled over, but on instinct told my wife to stay in the car. All my internal alarms were going off. I could hear my own heartbeat, and I just felt watched for some reason. She knows to trust me when I have moments like this, so she looked more critically at the situation. The following description is a combination of what we both noticed. So there were boulders from the field that had been dragged close to the road. There were streaks of fresh soil. It was very obvious, too, that they had just recently been moved. And on the far side of the recently moved boulders, I could see a bluish light, as though someone facing the road was reading something on their phone just out of sight. The light turned off, though, as soon as I looked that way. The man laying in the gutter was definitely breathing. There was no blood near him, and his back and sleeves were clean. If he had been hit by a car or fell, he'd be dirty, right? So we had to go, and I just knew it. I punched the gas pedal, and we got the heck out of there. In the rearview mirror, though, I saw 5 men running out from behind the boulders who had been running at the car and stopped when we sped away, but they were watching us leave. And one of them helped up the guy who was laying down. When we got to our destination, I called the police and reported it, but they basically told me to sit on it and spin. A few days later, the news reported that there was an attack at night, location undisclosed, but in this particular town, where a person pulled over their car when they saw a man lying in the road, and was attacked by the man and his cohorts. Thankfully, the victim managed to escape, but it was definitely a bait-and-switch tactic. So, I feel like I should give some background about my family situation first to avoid confusion here. I have a half-brother who is 3 years younger than me from my dad's second marriage, who I just refer to as my brother. I also have a full-blooded sister who was 2 years older. When my dad divorced his second wife, she got primary custody of my brother, so we only got to see him maybe every other weekend when he would come over. My sister and I spent most, if not all, weekends at our bio mum's house, which made it difficult to see my brother for any length of time except in passing. My dad went off with his soon-to-be third wife and left my sister and I with our grandparents, who raised me from age 9 to 18. My dad and brother would stay with at my grandparents' on the weekends, and my dad would have visitations due to him wanting to keep his affair with his third wife a secret from my brother, for reasons that are far too complicated to get into this story, but hopefully that'll make sense. So when my sister and I first moved in with my grandparents, they were getting ready to sell the house and move to a completely different town. Our house was a bit bigger, and we each got our own bedrooms. We were very excited to be someplace new. I was 9 years old and in the 4th grade. My sister was 11 and in the 6th grade. My brother was 6 years old. Now, I believed in ghosts prior to living in this house due to an experience I had at a friend's house where I saw a shadow person. So I was in no way a skeptic to the paranormal, but I didn't really connect the dots with the experiences that I had until I was much older. The first odd thing that's always stuck with me too was the very first weekend my brother was over. I was going to my mum's house that weekend, and so my brother got to choose which of our bedrooms that he would sleep in while he was with my grandparents. And he picked mine, of course, and I was very much a perfumey smell, good candle-loving type girl, and I didn't want a stinky boy in my bed, so I objected. He said that he picked my room because my walls were painted blue and that was his favorite color. He was very excited. My grandma didn't give in to my protests in the end, saying that I needed to learn to share. But when I came back from my mum's, my brother came to me and said that he didn't want to ever sleep in my room again because there was a ghost living in there. He was honestly terrified and no longer excited. At the time, I thought that he was just being a scaredy cat baby who still believes in the boogeyman being under his bed. I scoffed and made fun of him, as older siblings do. But that moment always just stuck out to me for some reason. Now looking back, I wonder what he did experience. They say young children are sensitive to ghosts, so perhaps that had something to do with it. The next odd thing, though, that happened was the first night that we lost power. We lived in a pretty wooded area, so in the fall the wind would blow hard and knock branches into the power lines. We had constant power outages that time of year. And that night, when I went to bed, I had a dream that I woke up in the middle of the night. Everything in my dream was exactly as it was in reality. Same bedspread, same posters on the wall, everything. Only I had a fearful feeling come over me. I sat up in my bed and looked to the corner of my room where my bookshelf was, and there, crouching in front of the bookshelf, was this grotesque goblin-like creature just staring at me. Something about it just freaked me out too and made me wake up, and when I woke up, somehow I was brave enough to look over on my bookshelf, and there was nothing there. That was the last night, though, that I slept in my room during a power outage. Every time the power went out, I would always sleep in my sister's room. The dream sat with me for some time, and it scared me a lot. But once again, I sort of brushed this experience off as time went past as just a bad dream. The next thing that happened was perhaps the most bizarre. My grandparents spoiled me with a TV in my room and cable, so I would watch TV before bed every night. When I was ready to go to bed, I would turn the TV off and put the remote on my bedside table. It wasn't uncommon for me to toss and turn in the night and knock off the remote. I would often find it on the floor and under the bed and even wake up to myself knocking it off. And one morning, my remote wasn't on my side table. I looked on the floor and it wasn't there. I looked under the bed and it wasn't there either. I went as far as pulling all the furniture away from the walls to see if it flung across the room or something. I looked and looked and the remote was just nowhere to be found. I was completely at a loss. I had no idea where it could have possibly went, and weeks went by. I just couldn't find it. It just disappeared into oblivion. But then my grandmother was doing laundry and decided it was time to change the sheets on my bed. She couldn't lift up the mattress by herself to get the fitted sheet on, so I would help. I also couldn't lift it by myself, so we had to work together. We lifted up one side, and my remote was dead center between my mattress and the box spring. I was shocked and dumbfounded, to say the least, as to how it got there. I never did rationalize it too, and it's just remained a mystery all this time. A very similar thing happened with my glasses sometime later. I would also put them on the bedside table before bed, and one morning they just weren't there. I searched and searched before I finally spotted them. They were on the top of my bookshelf though, and the top shelf was way too high for me to reach. In fact, I had to climb up the first 2 shelves in order to retrieve them. And for the life of me, I still don't understand how they got there. Whenever my brother came over after his first time staying in my room, he would sleep in the living room with my dad. My dad didn't live with us, but would spend the weekends with my brother at my grandparents' house, as I stated above. My brother was terrified to go to the bathroom, which was directly across the hall from my bedroom, in the middle of the night by himself. He would wake my dad to escort him, and my brother finally confessed after all these years as to why as well. He told me that one time he went to the bathroom in the middle of the night and he left the door cracked. While he was doing his business, a man's disembodied head appeared in the doorway, staring at him, and whispered something incoherent at him. And that is why he never went to the bathroom alone again. Our bathtub had a sliding glass door, as opposed to a curtain. I took a shower before bed one night, and when I stepped out, the glass door came off the track and slammed down on my foot, and it severed my little toe like a guillotine. Now, the door was never loose before that night, and never did that before, but I spent the rest of my evening in the ER that night, and I don't know if this event was paranormal in nature, but when I look back at all the other things that happened, I often do wonder. My sister, oddly enough, never experienced a single thing, but as my grandparents confessed when I was 18 and away at college, they too had some experiences. So when I was home visiting from college, my grandmother confessed that my grandfather and her were told when they bought the house that it was haunted. At the time, they didn't believe it, but weird things began to happen to them almost immediately. For instance, my grandma was cooking one afternoon while my sister and I were still at school, and my grandpa was taking a nap in their bedroom. My grandma put a spoon down on the counter after stirring what was the pot of food, and turned around to wash something in the sink or something like that, and when she turned back around, the spoon had disappeared. She couldn't explain it until she found it later in the living room on the couch on the other side of the house, and nobody else was in the home. Several times my grandma said that she was locked out of the house. She would step onto the back porch and shut the sliding door behind her, but when she tried to get in again, it would be locked. The sliding doors don't lock by themselves as well. She would have to find whatever room my grandfather was in and knock on the window to get back into the house. Apparently this happened often to many of the doors we had that led outside, not just the sliding door. At night, my grandparents would be getting ready for bed, and when they turned off the lights one night, suddenly all the lights in the house turned on by themselves, and so did the TV in their room. The volume turned all the way up. They knew too that it was whatever was haunting this house, so my grandfather yelled, "Knock it off," and everything turned off by itself in an instant. The realtor who sold the house to my grandparents disclosed everything to them. She explained the haunting as not being evil, but as mischievous. The most haunted rooms were the master bedroom, where my grandparents were, my bedroom specifically, and the bathroom. When my grandparents told me their experiences and all the weird things I experienced and my brother experienced, suddenly all made sense. This mischievous spirit hid my things because it was funny to watch me struggle to find them, and the dream I also had made sense. I mean, a goblin-like creature is a mischievous sort of creature, right? I don't like to speculate, and I don't really often talk about this, but I do feel like it was a spirit communicating to me through my dream, making its presence known. Perhaps the shower incident was it trying to pull a prank, or maybe not. I don't know. I did look into the history of the house, though, to see if there were any deaths, and there were none. The house was built in the 80s and had only one owner before us. We moved in 2003, so it was only 20 years old. But the house was at one point struck by lightning or something, and the garage was burnt down and had to be rebuilt, but there were no deaths. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed listening to my experiences, and I hope it all makes sense. I'm definitely not the best at articulating my thoughts.